Yes, so I'll be talking about phishing kits and how to teach a man to fish and feed him for a lifetime, or at least in a different sense, how basically what you see every day, you know, these bland fish that go around with spam emails, how they're set up with phishing kits. So it's nothing about the, you know, spear fishes, how did the Russians get into the Bundestag and all that. So it's really this everyday stuff. Somebody wants to steal your Google account. But there's still some really interesting stuff in here. Just real quick, not too much about that, just about me, very long title there. Working for the Gin team at Symantec. There's my Twitter account. If you like, just follow me there. Every now and then I post some fun stuff. Just a side note about the presentation. So I might get into hot water for giving this presentation. I sent it to my boss, and he replied last night and said, "There's a problem here. You're not using the latest corporate PowerPoint slide deck." So yeah, this could really be a problem. I didn't reply. I was more like, whatever. Quick intro, phishing kits. If you've never heard about a phishing kit, what is it? Pretty simple. It's what's sold on the cybercrime underground forums to set up a phishing page. It's mostly just a zip archive with some code, and you extract it wherever you want to, you know, point it, some web server, whatever, and it makes it a phishing page. Out of the box, you just extract it, it's a phishing page. So you can turn, you know, compromise your own server into a phishing round. They're sold typically for, you know, anywhere between $2 and $10. That's some research by some other teams at Symantec. They actually went and looked at the prices. So it doesn't mean that you couldn't sell it for, you know, 500, whatever. If it's a really good one, if someone's paying for it, they might pay more. And typically what the bad guys do, so they buy the phishing kit, and then they put it on a compromised server. They register at a free hosting provider, or even do their own server, roll their own server, go to bulletproof hosting, and then run their phishing page there. And then point some victims at that URL, and they hopefully enter the credentials. Here's an example. Here's a phishing kit extracted. So there's a bunch of PHP code, some images and JavaScript, what you would expect basically from a web application. So it's not much different. If you take this phishing kit here and extract it, put it on a web server that runs PHP, you will get this Google phishing. Then you point victims at the index.php, and this is what they get. Well, hopefully for the attacker, they enter the credentials, and it's sent to the attacker. Oh, wait. The only thing that you basically do is you have to configure a little bit. Like, where is that credential dropped? And that's it. That's the only thing you have to do. You don't have to know anything about PHP. You can just, you know, that's all you need to do. So now, phishing kits, they've been around for a little bit. What I'm going to be talking about today is some discovery I made a while back. And so people have written about phishing kits since 2007, I think. This is the earliest mention I found, that it was sold in the underground. But what I discovered, what I'll be talking about is a huge data set of phishing kits and how I analyzed it. I didn't go looking, though. So while I was preparing the slides here, I learned something new, a new term. It's called serendipity. And that really describes what happened during the discovery phase here. This was totally by accident. I didn't go looking. This is just, you know, pleasant surprise. Kind kind of like, other accidental scientific discoveries. Now, I'm not saying this is anywhere close to as important as these. Just to give you an idea, that was totally accidental. And here's a story how I accidentally discovered all those phishing kits. I was looking at a PHP file that I found just lying around on a web server that was compromised, this xboombercheck.php. And one of the things that I typically do, go to VirusTotal. It's one of those sources where you can find a lot about files. So I just did a query on this file. And, well, detection isn't very good, but that's not my point. So this is the script. It's pretty small. There's two portions. The first one, the top one, it basically checks if the remote address of the client, if you do a reverse lookup for this IP address and you get the host name, if it includes specific terms, for example, fish tank or Google or Amazon AWS. So basically the idea is they take the IP, this person wants to connect to us, reverse lookup, if it includes Google, you get a 404 page. So it's basically just about blocking the good guys. And then on the bottom here, it's the same idea, but this has regular expressions for IPs, so it will just block a certain range of IPs that they don't want, that basically they've seen maybe security researchers, maybe some companies they don't want snooping around on their on the compromised server, and they're just blocking them. Okay, so that just to describe what what this xboomber was doing. But where it got interesting is the file was included in 45 file bundles on VirusTotal. I'd encountered those every now and then before, but in totally different circumstances. What a file bundle in VirusTotal is basically it's an archive. So VirusTotal gets a file, like a zip file, a RAR, whatever. They extract it, and they say, well, here's 10 other files that were in there. So now we link those and say, this file was seen in this archive. Now, this xboomber was seen in 45 file bundles. So I was like, huh, that's interesting. So that means that I was looking at these file bundles, and they all turned out to be phishing kits. So I was like, well, this is interesting. So there's all these variants of phishing kits on VirusTotal that people are uploading. And I can link back to them by just saying, hey, give me this file and give me all the parents of this file. So at that point, I was thinking, well, it seems to be that there's many phishing kits on VirusTotal. And I did a query on VirusTotal. I don't know if you can see this. It's basically, saying engines Phish, which means give me all the detections that have Phish in them. So AV detection for Phish. It's not always that good, but it gives you mostly phishing pages or some HTML, and the type is zip. And that then yielded over 1,000 files. So at that point, I was this guy. I was like, huh, this was interesting, but now I'm really looking into this. And there's something more. So now I had all these phishing kits. I found a couple of thousand. I have the exact number later. I went and then looked at specific files and their parent files, and really went into VirusTotal and undug all these phishing kits. Went back years, like 2011, I think was the earliest phishing kit I could find. Now, more interesting discovery was when I looked at many of them, they were showing me, when you go to this tab in the wild in VirusTotal Intelligence, it tells you where it got the file from. And many of them said, well, there's a download URL, and this is where we got the zip from. So I was like, huh, this is interesting. So it seems like they leave these things behind when they extract it. So they use a phishing kit, they put it on a compromised server, they extract it and leave the zip behind, which is nice because if you can find the zip, you have the whole phishing kit, right? I don't have to go to VirusTotal and hope that I find it that way. So And that was me at that point. So I saw all these, all these fishes, and I was like, I want all of them. I want all of this code, all of the server code here. So I built a crawler to basically go and find it. And it's pretty simple. Luckily, my employer has a near endless supply of phishing URLs that comes in every day. So I grab a phishing URL, and then I go looking for a phishing kit on the same server. I go traversing the parent directories. Idea being that you have a zip, you extract it into a subdirectory. And typically, what the name of that subdirectory is the name of the zip plus .zip. So I check that. I check the subdirectory plus .zip. And oftentimes I find those phishing kits there. The other way is if I look at the directories and then it's an index, like an open index just from the web server, it tells me what files are in this directory. I can just go, hey, is there a .zip in there? And then I grab the zips on that server. So here's an example. There's a Dropbox phish. There's the phishing URL, the single Latino professionals.com document Dropbox proposal. And then I just go, and well, I don't, but the crawler goes through and first checks all the subdirectories for open indexes, and then checks the subdirectory names plus .zip for any files. So I just hammer this thing and see, is there a .zip there? Well, give it to me. It's my phishing kit, I hope. There's some heuristics after that to figure out, because every now and then there's other files, .zips, that are not phishing kits, but I have some heuristics in place that just look at the file and say, well, is there any web content in there? If it's not, then it's probably not a phishing kit. And in this case, so in this example, this is the Dropbox.zip that I can grab from there. So the data sets, all in all, VirusTotal, I mentioned that a couple of thousand, so 2,900. That's first with a query just for phish and zip. And then also some cross-correlation, taking some of the resources and saying, give me all the parents. I know that a certain CSS file is used in all these phishing kits, so give me all the parent archives that it's included in, and then I download them. So that gives me almost 7 gigabytes of phishing kits. And then the crawler, I've been running it since October, 6,400 unique zip archives until last week from 13,000 URLs. So we've seen many of them multiple times, over 9 gigabyte uncompressed phishing kits, almost 130 targeted brands, and the top phishing kit was deployed 98 times. I did a little bit of clustering on these because I wanted to see, basically, when I say a unique archive, I looked at just the SHA-256 hash. Now, even if you change a file name, that changes the whole hash of the zip. Or you obviously change the configuration file. So every time this is a different phishing kit, it's not if you just change the configuration to drop the credentials somewhere else. So I was trying to cluster to get an idea what are the kit families, where are slight changes in there. The technique doesn't matter so much. I used the shared files between kits and then ran some algorithms on that. For VirusTotal, I got 129 clusters. So these kind of boil down to a bunch of, kit families that have slight changes between them, and then the same for the crawler. And then just to give you a little bit of an idea how often we see them, this is the histogram. So for all these 229 kit families, how often did we see them? So the top one we saw over 400 times. So it was used over 400 on over 400 different servers to deploy this phishing kit. But then you also have a very long tail of some phishing kits that are just used a handful of times. Okay, now to the fun part, the analysis of all this. So now I was sitting on something like 13 gigabytes of phishing kits, mostly PHP code. I can see how most people think that's not fun, but I thought it's a lot of fun. First of all, I hope you can somewhat see that. So there's going to be a little bit of PHP code. I'm trying to explain most of it. If there's questions, yeah, just let me know at the end. First of all, how do most of these phishing kits get the credentials that are stolen to the attackers? Typically, we would say, well, maybe they're just dumping it into a file and then copying the file away. Or they have a database and they store it on the database. The problem with these techniques is that when you have a compromised server and it gets shut down, or you have a hosting provider and it gets deleted, it's gone. So you have to basically hammer it all the time and query all the credentials, slurp them away. So there's an easier way, and I would say 99% of these phishing kits do it that way. They actually, every time credentials get stolen, they mail away the credentials to some email dumps, some email address somewhere, and just say, well, this is the username and password, or whatever they're looking for. This is the credit card number. So this is an example for this code, and it gathers all kinds of information. It takes the post. So basically, this is the code that receives the posted password username and then just emails away. Puts a subject in there, so the subject in this case is Dropbox update, and then it actually has the IP of the victim. The two is basically the email dead drop, where the attacker sits on to just get all those dumb credentials, and then they have this email body, the Dropbox login info by solo, email password sent from IP on time. And after all that, so it calls the mail function, which basically, so why this works is that mostly on these servers, typically you would have a PHP installation, you would have Linux running, and then it just goes through, system, mail, whatever is set up there, which luckily for the attackers is set up most of the time, and sends it to, whatever Gmail address. Now, you typically would say, well, it comes from some internet server that right away sends it to Gmail. But remember, it doesn't, even if it goes to spam, it's the attackers. They just pull it out of spam and say, well, great. Google, don't worry about this, I got this. And then at the end, they redirect you to Dropbox.com. So it kind of seems your login didn't work and you get redirected to the original Dropbox page in this case. Okay, so this is how they get the credentials. Now to some interesting stuff, working for a security company. Obviously, since we now have the server-side code of all these phishing kits, and they're trying to evade detection, they're trying to evade us finding them, they're trying to evade basically all the security companies, the search engines, to find the phishing pages. Now we get a look into how do they try to do that. And then obviously learn how can we evade the evasion. There's a couple of things that are typical or that I've gathered here that I wanted to talk about. The first one is basically when they try to outright see some detail, some metadata around the client that they don't like and say, well, we don't want this person or whatever software it is, we don't want them visiting and seeing our phishing page. It's not a legitimate victim. So they're blocking IPs, they're blocking the reverse lookup host names, user agents, they're sometimes blocking entire countries. In that, I think mostly it's about, well, I don't want to phish anybody in my own country, or along those lines. A couple of techniques that they typically do it. I'll give some examples. It's HTTP access files, robots.txt, then straight out PHP, and then it actually goes into evasion of security software. In that case, simple variant is polymorphic URLs, basically redirecting every visitor to a unique copy in a subdirectory. And that helps against straight up blacklisting. So whenever you detect a phishing page and you say, well, this full URL is now a phishing page, and we block it wherever we see it. Now they will redirect every user to a different variant of it, so that doesn't work. And then the last one, content obfuscation. Here's an example of an htaccess file. Just real quick, htaccess files, basically it's just a configuration file for the web server. You drop it in the directory that it applies to and the subdirectory it applies to. And you just say, you can code different rules into the htaccess file that says, well, in this case, for example, IPs deny everything from this IP range. And so I found one where this person made some comments there. So he sees, he doesn't want the clown from the Netherlands siphoning Bible site. I don't even know what that means. Siphoning a Bible site. Some spammers and a clown on Comcast. So, we can already see this guy is probably clown phobia. And then there's other rules you can code into an htaccess file, like user agents. He's looking for specific user agents that are typically coming from specific bots, and they're blocking that as well. Nothing too crazy. Also, nothing too crazy to evade, if I even have to mention that. IPs, well, look for an IP that they're not looking for. User agents use a user agent that they're not looking for. Robots.txt doesn't apply so much to security companies, I think. I haven't never heard about a security researcher that would look for a robots.txt, and if it exists, leave the attackers alone. Don't scan for stuff. So robots.txt is basically, it's a configuration file. You put it in the root of the web server, and the idea is that the search engine, it goes there, it looks for robots.txt, and then follows what the robots.txt tells it, so that Google, for example, goes to your domain and sees, well, they don't want me to scan this subfolder because maybe there's some security concerns, whatever. And these guys are actually using that, so they don't end up on Google, on Bing, and on other search engines. Like I said, there's not much evading. Just ignore this thing. If you're looking for phishing, obviously. Then the polymorphic URLs. Here's an example of how they create polymorphic URLs. On the bottom, the first 4 lines there, that's where they create a subdirectory name. First, they get a random number, a very large random number. Then they create an MD5 out of the string of that random number. Then they base64 encode that MD5, and then the MD5 that base64 doesn't make any sense. Don't try to make any sense out of it. This doesn't help at all. But at the end of the day, they have a pretty random hex subdirectory, and probably don't get many collisions. And basically, then there's a function recurse copy. So what the whole thing just does, it creates this, a random subdirectory hex string, and then it takes the source and copies it to this new subdirectory, and then redirects the victim to that new subdirectory. Nothing too crazy. Evading this is basically, if you see many variants that have obvious, differences, then don't go looking for the full URL, but block something else. Maybe block the content. Content obfuscation. There's really thousands of ways you can do that. And over the years, I've seen many, many ways that the bad guys try to obfuscate the content. This one was an interesting way, though. It's straight out AES. So they have an AES implementation in PHP, some open source code they're using here. And at the end, what they're doing is they're taking their page, the full page that they want to encrypt, and encrypt it with AES, put it in some kind of stub that just, you know, a JavaScript variable that just holds the whole page, and when it's loaded, it's decrypted. And so what's doing the decryption here is the HOK.js, which conveniently is the AES implementation in JavaScript. So basically all you see going to this page, the content is this stub, this small stub, HTML with the script, and then, you know, basically the decryption routine and a huge blob that is just AES encrypted. So there's no way that you can signature at least the blob. You can't. You could maybe signature on the decryption routine. There's other problems with that, obviously, because then, you know, you could run into FPs if this is ever used legitimately. Okay. A couple of statistics around those, at least the first three techniques. How often I've seen them across those, the crawler data set. The HT-access was seen in 18% of the kits. Robots.txt, also seen a lot, 8%. And then the PHP variant, at least the ones that I could find, I kind of signatured for the way they're typically doing it, so I might be missing some of them. It's around 15%. So there's some, you know, they're trying in, I wouldn't say the majority of phishing kits are trying to block the good guys, but then you could also make a very good case for if they have an evasion that will be perfect, how would I get the phishing URL in the first place and then get the kit? Does that make sense? So if I didn't detect it in the first place, I never get the URL to slurp the phishing kit, right? So you could say maybe the percentage is much higher, but they just have the perfect evasion. I don't think so. There's 210 variants of HT-access files, and the top variant was used in 180 phishing kits. So there's some sharing across those. Robots.txt, the same, and then some somewhere around the same for PHP. Okay. Now, that was the most fun, looking at phishing kits, vulnerabilities. I found a ton of vulnerabilities in those PHP, well, if you will, web apps. And basically, and in conclusion, I can already say that they are not much better than, you know, most PHP coders out there. They're actually probably much worse. And I found, these are just some of the vulnerability classes I found. Basically, you can find vulnerabilities across all the major classes in these phishing kits. Now, a word of caution here when I show these. Not all of the vulnerabilities apply to all versions of PHP. So what that means is if you install a certain kit that has a vulnerability on a compromised server that runs PHP 5.2, I might be able to get in through it. If they install it on PHP 7, might be mitigated by PHP itself, right? So just word of caution, some of these are kind of outdated, but they're still there. It's not like, you know, it's still bad coding if they do it. Just because PHP fixed it doesn't mean they're not bad coders. And then another word there, or another side note, think about it that way. If it's a compromised server, the attacker doesn't care about the security of their phishing kit, right? They already got in through a security vulnerability somewhere, probably in a web application that's different, like a WordPress, whatever. But they don't care much about the security. So there's a good chance that you can actually get in or do some other stuff. I'll comment on that a little bit, what you can actually do with these. First example is file manipulation. That's a simple one. So in this case, it was a phishing kit where you uploaded, or you were asked to upload your passport as a scan. So if you do that, it actually has a post, and it receives a file that is uploaded. And there's a vulnerability in here. Any guesses? Where's the vulnerability? What could we do with this? Well, don't be shy. Nobody? Upload a PHP file. Just upload your favorite web shell to the doc directory and execute it. Yeah, that's the simplest way of doing it. Another way, what you could do is override a different file using directory traversal. Typically, PHP sanitizes this name field in the uploaded files, but there had been vulnerabilities against that in the past. So you can, for example, there was a vulnerability where you could just write to the root of the web server and overwrite a file. So that's the other way you can do it. But obviously, so what you can do with it, I mean, you can completely take over that server and do whatever you want after you upload the web shell. File inclusion, any guesses about that one? What can you do? It's again the input from the user, so the get parameter in this case, so the query string is unsanitized. Before it was the file upload, sometimes it's the post. Any guesses what you can do? There's two different things you can do. Yes, very good. There's local file inclusion or remote file inclusion. Local file inclusion, if you know a specific file is somewhere, on there, you can include it. You could, for example, include etc password. Well, it doesn't help so much in the phishing kit example. Remote file inclusion means you can actually just host your own, again, web shell somewhere and just point this to say, well, include my web shell, please, and it would run. In this case, again, that's mitigated by some versions of PHP. So sometimes it's allowed, sometimes it's not. It's disabled by default on PHP 5.x. So now something that doesn't really apply, but it's still there, cross-site scripting. Why doesn't it really apply? Well, because the victim itself would be the victim of the cross-site scripting. So what do you want to do with it? Like, you actually control what you get back. But they still have cross-site scripting vulnerabilities all over the place. So they would be probably kicked out if they were ever trying to get a real web application development job. They would be kicked out on day one for this kind of stuff. So in this case, so it stores the username from the post variable, the password, and then down there in the input, you see the value. It just echoes out, that username and password. In that case, typical cross-site scripting, you just close the tag and do whatever you want. You put whatever you want in the website. Here's an interesting one: HTTP response splitting. Again, doesn't really apply in this case of phishing kits, but I've seen, or this actually can be seen all over the place in phishing kits as well. Kind of similar to the to cross-site scripting. In this case, it takes the login and password and then puts it into a header. So again, what you can do is you close the header, this one header, with a new line, and then put your own header in whatever you want in the response. Again, there PHP introduced some mitigations against that with the header field as well. SQL injection. So I mentioned before, 99% of the phishing kits I've seen use, mailing to mail away the credentials. Some of these kits come with their own SQL server, so they actually store the dump credentials in a database. So in this case, it takes email and pass, and then inserts it into the database. Typical SQL injection, you close the query and do whatever you want, drop the table, doesn't matter. This is my favorite one, command execution. The first line, or the second line in here is the important one. It takes the input from C, from this query variable C, and runs pass-through. Does anybody know what pass-through does in PHP? Yeah, executes an external program on the command line. So you basically can just give it a command that it runs with the query string. Okay, that's it for vulnerabilities. Now, what I found a lot is backdoors, meaning the scammers are scamming the scammers. Shocking, huh? Oftentimes, what they basically want is steal the credentials that the other phishers are trying to steal. So they're just making a copy for themselves and sending it to their own page. So in this case, there's this line. So again, it looks pretty much the same. They're preparing this email, but there's just before the mail function executes, there's this include once docs file button.gif. And when you look at the GIF, it's not a GIF, it's a PHP file. And there's some kind of obfuscation, eval, base64 code, whatever. But what it does, I can just tell you, it basically just mails away the credentials to their own site. The last piece of the analysis that I wanted to say, where basically it was the most impressive part, where they put in a lot of work, is true logins. That is basically when the credential gets stolen, they have the server check if you could log in with the credential. And only if they can log in with it would they dump it. So they do an online check, and otherwise they say, oh, your password's wrong, do it again. And they do it with curls, so they figure out what's a good URL to ask, what's the post parameter, and so on. They put the username, password, it's all right. And in this case, they have a regular expression for the response from, in this case, iCloud. So if the response includes error, oh, I don't want that password, it's wrong. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for your password, and go on. So that way, they kind of reduce the number of credentials that don't work. That's it. Thank you.